I had exactly $14,207 left in my personal checking account when I realized my brother had emptied $487,320 from the restoration trust my father left behind, and done it while I was flat on my back recovering from abdominal surgery with a morphine button and a paper wristband still cutting into my skin. The nurse thought I was shaking from pain. I wasn't. I was staring at a padded envelope someone had left in the chair by the hospital window. No return address. Inside was a black USB drive, a copy of an LLC filing I had never seen, and a sticky note in block letters that read, "Check the timestamps before they bury you." I dropped the note, picked it back up, and for a second I honestly thought I might throw up. Then I put the phone face down. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost merciful, that if I handled this correctly, what came next would not be loud. It would be documented. It would be public. And it would be final. Let me take you back. My name is Mara Ellison. I was 38, a licensed historic preservation architect in Savannah, Georgia, and the sort of person people trust with old things because I move carefully around them. Buildings, records, family stories. My flaw, if I'm being honest, was that I had spent too many years believing careful people could eventually earn fairness from reckless ones. My older brother, Reed, had built his whole adult life on that assumption. He was 42, polished, persuasive, and permanently short on money in ways that never seemed to touch his suits, his watch, or the expensive bourbon he liked to swirl while talking about vision. After our father died, Reed began calling himself the natural steward of the Ellison legacy, which sounded noble if you didn't know him very well. If you did, it sounded like a warning. Our father, Thomas Ellison, had owned several blocks of commercial property near the river and spent the last decade of his life funding coastal restoration work through a private trust. He believed in marshland, apprenticeships, old brick, and boring paperwork. He also believed, correctly, that money changes the temperature of a room faster than grief. So his estate plan was complicated in the way competent estate plans usually are. There was an irrevocable trust, a donor-advised fund, a property LLC, and a fraud carve-out that my father's lawyer explained to us in a conference room the week after the funeral while Reed kept checking his phone. If any beneficiary attempts to redirect, conceal, or misappropriate trust assets, the attorney said, tapping the relevant paragraph, they can be suspended pending judicial review. Reed leaned back and smiled like someone at a wine tasting. Dad always did love drama, he said. I remember that because I looked at the page and thought, no, Dad loved contingencies. There's a difference. 3 months later, I had surgery I'd been putting off for years. Nothing glamorous. An ugly, painful medical problem that got worse every time I ignored it in favor of work, deadlines, and family cleanup. I told Reed I'd be offline except for urgent estate matters. He said, "Take care of yourself, Mare. I've got it handled." Calm voice. Warm tone. The kind that should come with sirens. The clock started in a downtown law office 11 days after I was discharged. I was still walking slowly, still sleeping in a recliner, still pretending I was stronger than I was when our father's longtime attorney, Naomi Vega, called and said, "You need to come in today." Naomi was in her 60s, exacting and allergic to wasted syllables. When I got there, she had 2 folders on the table and a legal pad turned sideways. She didn't offer coffee. That's how I knew it was bad. She slid the first folder toward me. Reed petitioned to appoint himself managing member of Ellison Wharf Holdings while you were hospitalized. I stared at the notarized signature page. My name was on it. That's not my signature. I know. Then she looked me in the eye and said the line that split the day in half. If you miss this, you lose everything. She explained it in the calmest possible terms. Reed had used the LLC to encumber 2 properties as collateral for a short-term business loan tied to his events company, Harbor Slate. If the loan matured and defaulted, lenders could begin clawing at assets they had no business touching. Meanwhile, nearly $500,000 had been moved out of the Restoration Trust under descriptions that read consulting, donor strategy, and site activation. Meaningless phrases. Decorative lies. The kind designed to survive a first glance. I remember saying, "How did this happen in 10 days?" Naomi said, "Not 10. Longer. 10 days is just when he stopped hiding it. The wounds in my family were old enough to have weather patterns. Reed had always been the golden child in the most exhausting, ordinary way. He was not brilliant. He was simply expensive. My father loved us both, but my mother died when I was 12, and after he remarried Celeste, the household reorganized itself around whatever kept Reed comfortable. When I was 15, I won a statewide design scholarship, and Reed crashed my small dinner celebration by announcing he'd been waitlisted at a private college he couldn't afford but deserved. Celeste cut my cake and said, "Let's not make this evening too much about one child." I still remember standing there with a scholarship letter in my hand and frosting on the knife, learning that achievement could be treated like bad manners. The second incident came years later, after I finished graduate school and came home to help my father restore the Broughton Street buildings. We were at one of Reed's engagement parties. There were 3 engagements before one finally stuck, and I overheard Celeste telling a woman from her church, "Mara is useful. Reed is special. Not talented. Not kind. Special." As if usefulness were what remained after better categories had been assigned. I made the mistake of confronting her in the kitchen. She smiled, touched my wrist, and said, "Sweetheart, every family has someone who carries the practical load. You wear that role beautifully. Calm cruelty always lands harder because it asks you to admire its manners." By the time Naomi showed me the forged documents, none of that surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Some betrayals arrive after enough rehearsal that the real feeling is not pain but administrative focus. Naomi opened the second folder. Inside were transfer ledgers, escrow correspondence, and a printout of a revised donor agreement I had never authorized. "This came in 30 minutes before you arrived," she said. "Anonymous courier." The second folder changed everything. Tucked between the pages was the same black USB drive from the hospital envelope. Naomi had already copied its contents onto an air-gapped laptop in the next room because Naomi is the type of woman who says air-gapped without irony. The drive contained a compressed archive of emails, board memos, raw video files, and export logs from Harbor Slate's internal server. Not enough on its own, she warned me. Anonymous evidence is a door, not a verdict. But if authenticated, it could show intent, sequencing, and knowledge. In other words, the thing liars hate most: context. We started with the metadata because the sticky note had been right. Reed had circulated a glossy donor video at one of the Foundation's planning meetings, claiming our father had orally approved temporary cross-collateralization between the trust and his events company. The clip showed my father in his office, frail but lucid, apparently saying Reed should move money where it can grow. Several board members had relied on it. One had even emailed that it seemed consistent with Thomas's entrepreneurial instincts. What the raw file on the USB showed was different. The visible timestamp had been cropped in the presentation copy, and the export data revealed the audio had been stitched from 2 separate recordings made 7 months apart. My father had never said the sentence Reed attributed to him. He had said, in one clip, "move," while pointing to a rolled set of plans, and in another, "money where it can grow is money placed under restriction." Reed had trimmed the second half clean off. I sat there staring at the waveform on Naomi's screen and felt something inside me go completely still. "Can we prove it?" I asked. "Yes," Naomi said. "But proving it fast is the game." We retained a forensic accountant named Vivek Shah and a digital forensics consultant named Lena Boone. Vivek was all clean collars and brutal summaries. Lena looked like she'd rather be repairing a sailboat than testifying in Chancery Court, which made me trust her immediately. They worked in parallel. Vivek traced the trust disbursements through 3 layers of shell vendors, 2 of which shared mailing addresses with Harbor Slate subcontractors. Lena authenticated the file history, the altered video sequence, and the creation dates on the forged signature pages. One of the notarized forms had supposedly been signed by me at 3:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, while hospital records placed me in post-op recovery under sedation. Another included printer microdot patterns matching a device in Reed's office. Tiny yellow dots. Invisible to most people. Ruinous to the right person. But evidence alone does not stop people like Reed. It just changes their tone. The escalation came when he realized we were no longer confused. He sent me a text first. Heard you're spiraling. Let's keep family matters private. Then Celeste called from a blocked number and left a voicemail soft enough to sound maternal if you ignored the words. Dragging your brother through court after your father's death would be a disgrace to his memory. Also, consider the optics of your medical situation. People may question your judgment during recovery. I played that message twice. Not because I doubted what I heard, because I wanted to remember exactly how clean the threat sounded. Then Reed moved from pressure to humiliation. Savannah's preservation community is small and enjoys gossip dressed as concern. 2 days before the annual Tide and Timber Gala at the Maritime Museum, where our foundation was scheduled to announce a major grant in my father's name, Reed arranged for whispers to circulate that I'd become unstable after surgery, that I was contesting routine estate decisions out of resentment, that Naomi was weaponizing grief on my behalf. One board member called and said, "I'm sure there's a misunderstanding." Another said, "Reed seems heartbroken by all this." Heartbroken is a popular costume. The gala mattered because donors, city officials, preservation trustees, and half the people who laundered ambition through philanthropy would be there. Reed planned to use the event to cement his authority, announce a new public-private venture, and lock sympathetic board members into place before we could file for emergency relief. He wanted the room before he faced the record. I understood that instinct. Rooms are how men like him survive the days before documents catch up. Then our ally surfaced, and that was the first twist I genuinely hadn't seen coming. Her name was Felicity Ward, and I knew her only as Reed's executive assistant, a composed woman in her 30s who wore neutral blouses and kept meeting packets aligned to the millimeter. She emailed Naomi from a private account with a single sentence, "I have the missing canary clause memo, and I'm done covering for him." A canary clause is the legal equivalent of a silent alarm. My father had insisted on one after a prior business dispute years earlier. Naomi explained it to me in the conference room while printing the email. If certain restricted entities or collateral structures ever appeared in internal authorization language, it would signal intentional misuse rather than clerical error, because only a handful of people knew those phrases existed. Reed had used one. Exactly. In writing. He had copied language from a sealed memo he was never supposed to touch and inserted it into a lender package, effectively proving he knew he was accessing protected structures he had no right to leverage. Felicity met us after dark in the parking deck behind a grocery store off Victory Drive. Not cinematic. Fluorescent. Damp. Real. She handed over a manila envelope and said, "He told me to backdate board notices and change subject lines on the video export chain. I did some of it. Then he told me to delete a voicemail from your father." I asked why now. She looked embarrassed, which made her answer more credible. "Because he used my login to send one of the transfer approvals, and if this blows up without context, it lands on me too." Then, after a second, "and because your father was decent to me when my son was sick." Reed wasn't. Inside the envelope were printouts, but the real gift was the voicemail she had recovered from a server backup before deleting the original per Reed's instruction. My father's voice was weak, but unmistakable. "Mara," he said, "if Reed asks you to move anything between the trust and the properties, don't sign. He's impatient, and impatience around restricted funds becomes theft faster than people admit." I had to stop the recording halfway through because my throat closed. Naomi placed a hand flat on the table between us, not touching me, just studying the air. "This isn't revenge," she said. "This is justice." We filed that night for an emergency temporary restraining order, an asset freeze, and suspension of Reed's authority as purported managing member. Naomi's petition was surgical. Forged deed-adjacent documents. Fraudulent notarized signature. Altered media presented to fiduciaries. Improper trust disbursements. Risk of irreparable harm. She attached affidavits from the hospital records custodian, the forensic consultant, the accountant, and Felicity. By morning, the complaint existed in the world, which meant Reed's problem had changed shape. It was no longer my word against his. It was his swagger against a docket number. Still, the gala was 2 nights away, and the court hearing could not happen before then. Reed understood timing. So did I. I decided to attend. The Maritime Museum had rented the old warehouse annex on the river, all iron beams and expensive floral installations trying to look effortless. Savannah in spring can feel like a place hiding its teeth behind ferns. Reed arrived in a midnight tuxedo and moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting donors, kissing cheeks, and pausing just long enough beside me to say, "You look tired, Mara." I was wearing a black dress with a high neckline because my surgery incision still ached and because I didn't owe anyone softness. "I am," I said. "You should be too." He smiled at that. It was a mistake men make when they think composure belongs to them. The evening began small. Cocktails. A string trio. A donor slideshow looping marsh images over the bar. Reed took the stage first to thank attendees for continuing my father's vision. He used my father's name 6 times in 4 minutes. Then he announced a forthcoming adaptive redevelopment initiative tied to Ellison Wharf Holdings and Harbor Slate. There were nods in the room, pens lifting, phones recording. That was the first reveal he wanted, the clean one. The second reveal came from a place he didn't anticipate. The museum's executive director, a dry man named Walter Hines who cared more about governance than charm, stepped up to say the foundation had received late-breaking compliance questions and that any new initiative would be subject to board review. Reed's jaw twitched. Tiny movement. Easy to miss if you hadn't spent a lifetime watching him mask panic with posture. Then the bigger turn arrived. Naomi, who had not RSVP'd, walked in with a process server at her shoulder and handed Walter a sealed packet. Walter read the first page, removed his glasses, and looked at Reed with the expression men reserve for structural cracks in historic masonry. Not outrage. Calculation. The board chair, a donor widow named Jean Hollister, whose money had built half the room, asked loudly enough for 3 tables to hear, "Is this an injunction matter?" "Emergency application," Naomi said. Reed laughed. "Too soon. Too bright. This is family nonsense dressed up by litigators." Naomi said, "Then you won't mind if the video is played in full." He went quiet. That was the dramatic irony of the evening. Half the room still thought they were watching a sibling dispute. The other half had just realized they were standing inside an evidence chain. Walter signaled the AV tech to halt the donor reel. Reed took a step toward the control booth, but Jean said, "No. We're doing this now. Old money can move slowly for years and then all at once." The altered clip Reed had used before played first on the overhead screen. My father's face. His office. The doctored line. A few nods from people who recognized it. Then Lena handed the technician a second file. Raw export. Full metadata overlay. Creation time, modification time, user account, splice markers, audio discontinuity. The screen filled with timestamps Reed had assumed no donor would ever understand. Lena explained each one into a handheld microphone in plain English. This segment was exported after Mr. Ellison's recorded statement on restricted funds. That sentence was removed. This audio fragment originated from a separate recording made 7 months earlier. This user credential initiated the final render. She paused. The credential maps to Harbor Slate Media Admin, authorized by Reed Ellison. No one gasped. Real rooms rarely do. They just tighten. Reed said, "This is absurd. Metadata can be manipulated." "Correct," Lena said. "Which is why I also analyzed the server logs, backup snapshots, and checked some history." Then she listed them. Calmly. One by one. Reed turned toward me then. "Not Naomi. Not Lena. Me. You're doing this here?" I said, "You started here." He opened his mouth, but the nuclear reveal got there first. Jean Hollister had been one of my father's earliest donors, but what Reed apparently never learned was that she had also once practiced trust and estates law before inheriting her late husband's fortune. She extended her hand to Naomi, who passed her the Canary Clause memo Felicity had preserved. Jean read it standing under a chandelier, lips thinning as she tracked the language. Then she asked Reed, in the tone of a woman who had just stopped pretending to be confused, Why is restricted collateral syntax from a sealed fiduciary memo appearing in your lender packet? He said nothing. She raised the paper. This phrase is not accidental. It is a trigger phrase. Thomas used it specifically to identify intentional misuse. The room changed, not because of emotion, because of classification. Reed was no longer being discussed as impulsive or overwhelmed. He was being understood as deliberate. Then Felicity stepped out from the side corridor where she had been waiting with Naomi's associate. She was pale but steady. He told me to backdate the notices, she said, and to delete the voicemail from Mr. Ellison warning Mara not to sign anything moving trust money into Harbor Slate structures. The AV tech played the voicemail over the room speakers before anyone could stop him. My father's voice traveled under iron beams and expensive flowers and landed exactly where Reed had hoped to plant his redevelopment announcement. Silence after truth has a different weight than silence after surprise. It does not flutter. It settles. Reed tried one last tactic. He looked at the audience and spread his hands as if the sheer shape of his sincerity could save him. My sister has always resented my role in this family. It was such a small, stale lie that I almost felt sorry for him. Walter said, security. 2 guards approached, not rough, just formal, while donors suddenly found their glasses fascinating. Reed jerked his arm away and hissed, "You're making a spectacle." Jean answered before I could. "No, Reed. You did." By midnight, Harbor Slate's primary lender had been sent a preservation notice. By 8 a.m., our emergency hearing had been moved up. The Chatham County courtroom was colder than I expected. Reed arrived with counsel, though not the sleek litigator he would have hired before his cash tightened. Celeste sat behind him in cream wool and righteous stillness, as if she were attending a recital that might improve. I didn't look at her. I had learned that some people feel fed by being witnessed. Naomi went first. She moved through the record with the patience of someone laying clean boards across mud. Hospital records. The forged signature. The notary discrepancy. The printer microdots. The video manipulation. The shell vendors. The canary clause. The voicemail. The trust transfers. The collateralization risk. Each term was explained in scene to the judge with purpose. A forged deed-related authorization matters because it creates authority that never existed. A forensic audit matters because it traces intent through numbers people hoped looked routine. An affidavit matters because facts become portable under oath. Metadata matters because time itself becomes a witness. Reed's lawyer argued overreach, family animus, incomplete context. Then Naomi introduced the bank transfer matrix Vivek had finalized that morning. 3 of the consulting payments from the Restoration Trust had landed through 2 intermediaries as deposits against a venue buyout for Harbor Slate's private launch event series. Trust funds intended for Marsh Restoration had underwritten artisanal lighting and branded champagne walls. I saw the judge's face change before she spoke. The courtroom went silent. She granted the temporary restraining order, froze disputed assets, suspended Reed from any role in trust-adjacent management pending full adjudication, and authorized expedited discovery. When Reed began to protest, the judge held up a hand and said, "Mr. Ellison, the record presently before this court suggests not confusion but orchestration." It was not a dramatic sentence. It was better. It was precise. The rest happened the way serious consequences usually do, in filings, depositions, bank notices, board votes, and quiet resignations. Harbor Slate's lenders withdrew tolerance. 2 donors demanded clawback reviews. The Maritime Museum postponed its initiative and commissioned an external governance assessment. The foundation board removed Reed unanimously within 10 days. Celeste called twice, then sent a 6-page letter about loyalty, reputation, and public humiliation that never once used the word theft. Naomi filed it with the other exhibits because sometimes people authenticate their own character for you. During discovery, we learned the full shape of it. Reed had been underwater for almost 18 months. He had overpromised on experiential development contracts, papered over losses with bridge loans, and assumed he could refill the trust before anyone noticed. That is a very common kind of theft among polished people. Not hunger. Timing. They believe temporary misuse becomes acceptable if they manage to outrun the accounting. He didn't. 6 months later, he stipulated to a settlement under crushing civil exposure. He relinquished any claim to managerial authority over Ellison entities, consented to permanent removal from the trust and donor boards, accepted a judgment for misappropriated funds and fees, and signed a no-contact provision after one ugly voicemail too many slid into intimidation. The fraud carve-out in my father's estate plan was enforced exactly as designed. Reed's beneficial interest was suspended and ultimately redirected into a conservation scholarship program under judicial supervision. There was a restraining order after he appeared outside my office one rain-heavy evening and pounded once on the glass before thinking better of a second strike. Even it felt less like menace than collapse. Celeste moved to Naples within the year and began telling people she was taking time for family privacy. In Savannah, that phrase translates cleanly. There are records, and I would prefer not to discuss them. As for the innocent angle my brother thought would shield him, my father's legacy survived him. That mattered most. The Restoration Trust was stabilized, the encumbered properties were protected, and the scholarship program funded 3 apprentices from local trade schools in its first cycle. The Marsh project my father cared about moved forward under proper restrictions. I stood on a dock 6 months after the hearing with muddy boots and a rolled site plan under one arm and thought, not for the first time, that peace often looks like administration from far away. 1 year later, I was living in a renovated brick carriage house near Forsyth Park with a calmer nervous system, a better scar, and the strange luxury of no longer checking my phone before bed to see which family fire needed managing. Work was good. Real good. Not glamorous in the way Reed would have admired, but honest, stable, and mine. I taught one evening studio a semester at SCD, advised on preservation easements, and spent Sunday mornings with people who did not confuse access with entitlement. Felicity had a new job with a maritime insurer and sent me a card when the scholarship winners were announced. Naomi still corrected my punctuation in emails. I found that comforting. Reed rented a smaller place outside Atlanta and, according to the last update I received through counsel, was consulting under supervision for a company that specialized in distressed event properties. That struck me as almost literary, but life has a dry sense of humor. He was not ruined in the theatrical sense. He was simply limited by the truth, which is often the cleanest form of karma. Celeste remained exactly who she had always been, only now with fewer invitations and no audience large enough to mistake poise for innocence. For a long time, I thought boundaries were aggressive things. I thought saying no meant becoming hard. What I learned instead is that boundaries are architectural. They hold weight where love failed to. They keep rot from traveling. They let the structure stand. People ask, when they hear a softened version of this story, whether exposing my brother in public was satisfying. That's not the word I use. Satisfaction is dessert. This was repair. This was the moment the record stopped bending around the loudest person in the room. This was what happened when signatures, timestamps, affidavits, and one dead man's careful planning finally outranked family mythology. I still think about that envelope in the hospital chair sometimes. The black USB. The sticky note. Check the timestamps before they bury you. Whoever wrote it understood something important. Most betrayals don't survive sequence. Once people see what happened, when it happened, and who touched it, the story starts to collapse under its own staging. So that's my question for you. Have you ever had to stop asking for love from someone and start requiring documentation instead? And if this kind of slow burn justice story is your lane, subscribe and stay with me, because sometimes the quietest endings are the ones people earn the hardest.